misses it, we can just send them the link. So
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
so it's recording now, and I'll once we're done, I will bring it over to not iTunes, YouTube, my channel there. So, but I won't put it on the Montpelier channel. I'll just put it on my own private one. So, so any conversation is kept private. So, I think that when everybody arrives on Sunday to check in, before everyone gets their key, the hospitality group at Montpelier wants everybody to sign the COVID release that they've got, which is basically what that Sarah Lee sent to everybody. So I think a lot of folks have emailed it, but there'll be another one to sign. And I was gonna also for dinner that night, I was gonna have our COVID policy to give to everybody as well, so they could look it over. We've revised that just a little bit since the discussion on Friday. Nothing big. The major thing, and I want to talk about this today when everyone's on, is some of my staff had a really good point of having everybody think about what their COVID evacuation would be, if will, like if someone has symptoms. I mean, you brought this up the last time, Aaron, which I thought was really good, is what do we do if someone is exhibiting symptoms? Is that everyone should have in place like how they would leave. I mean, we would end the program at that point, but having it be that, whoever you rode with, you'd feel comfortable riding with if the driver or the passenger was exhibiting signs of COVID, because we want to plan for all this. And I don't think anyone would want to shelter in place. I think Montpelier is the last place anybody would want to, but if you did, we'd want to know that, seriously. So, that's something that could be an option, but probably wouldn't be something I said, again, I don't know if anybody would want to do. So, but what the program would end if that happened. So, which, of course, I don't think anyone would be able to work if, someone had symptoms, and it'd just be too stressful. But I'm hoping we don't have that, but want to be prepared. That way, if it does happen, it's not stressful. It's just like, hey, this is what happens. We're gonna get through this. So, but yeah, super excited about the program. It's one that is, it's always, when we do public programs, the methodology is, about the archaeology, of course, but there's also methodology of working with the public, and this is part of it now, which is, every field crew, whether it's biology or archaeology and teaching as well, it's all part of this group dynamic. So, well, what I was gonna do is go over what this lecture is all about, is something we call power of place, and also to introduce everybody to our dialogical approach to doing archaeology and presenting, which is basically, as it sounds, is having conversations, is trying not to have a monologue, but having a back and forth. And what we'll be talking about today is Montpelier in, all of its 2,700 acres, but in particular the visitor core that I'll define, when we start the PowerPoint presentation with maps and such. But how that, what the power of place is with Montpelier, being the place that, on one level, at one very specific time period, James Madison, for example, wrote the Virginia Plan in the summer of 1787 up in the study. And that's a place that has a lot of power, but then you've got the whole plantation being worked by enslaved Americans through different time periods and being owned by the father of the Constitution. That makes it a whole nother different power of place. And wanted to see, with everybody, what if you've heard power of place before, or what it brings to mind. And there's no one answer. That's kind of the beauty of this, is power of place. Especially when it comes to a historic home, it has different meanings it could be for the visitor, It could be for, I mean, for you all, it's what's the power of place of coming to Montpelier to dig for a week? Or it could be, what is the power of place for an enslaved individual? And there's all these different perspectives. I think you might have seen this in the background material. On Monday morning, we're going to be meeting in front of the main house. And at that point, we're going to ask everybody, we're going to do introductions then when all the staff is there. And have you all talk about one of your favorite spots or a place that has meaning to you. But we'll do that on Monday. After, and just in case anybody has any questions at the end of the presentation, I'll go over, see if anybody has any questions about the schedule coming up. So, but for you all, what is power of place? You know, what does that bring to mind for you all, power of place? And you all can unmute yourselves and talk. This is not a webinar. This is a Zoom meeting specifically. I could have set it up as a webinar, but we don't want that.
So Matt, one thing I've learned since March in this online teaching is we have this thing in education called like wait time, right? When we ask questions and you have to wait, and it feels even longer
in the classroom,
staring at a bunch of little boxes on the screen. But yeah, students, it's not a rhetorical question.
Yeah, definitely. You'll know when it's a rhetorical question, like, what color is this artifact? It's red. What in the world? So, but this is to get you all thinking. There's no wrong answer. I mean, the only wrong answer is if you have something that you're burning to say and you don't say it. That makes me sad. So.
Hi, for me, I guess I would just say power of place really reinforces, maybe an emotion that you might feel. You may feel like a stronger connection, and it can kind of evoke a different result in learning and kind of what you take away from an experience.
Yeah. And this is Maddie?
Yes.
Hi, Maddie.
Hi.
Is that short for Madison?
Yeah, my middle name.
Wow. Okay, that's very appropriate. So, yeah. For both where you go and visiting next week, this coming week, how would you see that as connected to place? What would make that special with a certain place? I really like what you said.
I would just say, like, for me, when I think about it, for example, like if you went to Disney World, you might feel more nostalgic, and it kind of draws upon your past experiences. Or if you go to Jamestown, you kind of are in that colonial mindset, and I guess it just reinforces what perspective you might take being there.
Yeah, so it's your a place just isn't a place. It's not. I mean, for some people, a cornfield has a lot of meaning, but it's not just a cornfield in the middle of Iowa. Mm-hmm. It is like Jamestown has and Williamsburg and Disney World have all kinds of meaning for different people. Yeah. Katie, I saw that you were unmuted and then you muted yourself. Were you going to say something?
I was going to say something pretty similar, just like something that could seem like very ordinary, like maybe even like grocery store, something like that, but it can hold like significance to certain people. So very similar along the lines, and then like how you're defining a place as well.
Yeah, no, I really like that. Is that bringing in those ordinary spaces, because what we're dealing with when we're looking at, say, the overseer's house or a smokehouse, for us, it's like, whoa, that's a 200-year-old site that is this building that's gone and we're discovering it. It's so cool, or it's reconstructed. But for the people that were there, the enslaved Americans who were there living and working in Montpelier, that was like the grocery store. It's just like, I'm going to Food Line tomorrow morning, and for me, that space isn't a big deal, until I have a memory of like 18 years ago, I remember my daughter run through the store and grabbing candy off the shelves, and then I get, it's really warming. And so, yeah, it's even ordinary places are have meaning. That's cool. And that's our stock and trade, is like for archaeologists, is finding those ordinary places and revealing what they were. Thanks, Katie. Oh, cool. Well, as we move through the what I'm talking about today with the PowerPoint, if anybody sees like this different, this perspective on power of place, bring it in, because it's something that as a historic property, as a historic home of James Madison, the enslaved Americans that were there for about over 100 years. This notion of power of place has a lot of meaning, and it's something that we don't try to determine for the visitor, but we try to reconstruct enough of what we've been able to figure out about the landscape and the history and how it combines, so people can start to imagine that, and then have Montpelier have a meaning for them in their own lives for whatever it is, their interest in plantations, their interest in American history, their fascination with presidents, their interest in their own family history and ancestors who were enslaved. So, but what I'll do, and also what this presentation is also going to do, is really get into, and I'm going to start sharing my screen right now, want to give you all some background on the history of Montpelier and some of the sites, and of course the best way to do this is to actually be out on the landscape, walking about, seeing the seeing what's there. And I'm going to get my laser pointer here. So, and what Montpelier consists of is about 2,700 acres. This is a map, and can everybody see the screen? Let me see. I'm going to bring up the everybody's face so I can see the notes. And let's see if we've got. Let me bring this other screen up here. Yeah, the notes are going to be up here. So, but if anybody has any questions, don't hesitate to shout them out. So you can just unmute yourself, because it's designed to be like a back and forth conversation. But for Montpelier, the area that's in white is what's owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I'll, in a couple of slides in a second, I'll show you the original Madison lands. But what we've got at Montpelier is a space where we restored the house, and we're looking at restoring the core of the landscape back to the 1820s appearance. This is to the time period when James and Dolly had retired to Montpelier, and there's about 120 slaves living and working at Montpelier. And so the perspective we're able to get with the archaeology is both on Madison, of course, which a lot of people come to Montpelier to visit to understand more of, but also the enslaved Americans who lived and worked at Montpelier for from the 1720s all the way up until the 1840s in the case of the Madison ownership, and that's when Dolly Madison sold the property. But for the for Montpelier, what we've got is in doing the archaeology, that's been how we've been able to discover the presence of the enslaved community. I mean, when you look at the slide back here, what in this picture right here, what's the most noticeable? And this is a rhetorical question, but it's but what aspect of it is most noticeable? And Hannah, I'm going to call on you. Are you there, Hannah?
You said what aspect is the most noticeable?
Yeah.
I guess the house.
Yeah, the house. And what do you see when you see the house? What really stands out?
It just I'm from Chesapeake, so it kind of reminds me of colonial Williamsburg in a way, just very, yeah, colonial.
Absolutely. Yeah, that major edifice out in the landscape is what really is the most noticeable, and that for years, Montpelier has been open since 1987, and for years what was dominant on the landscape, and the only thing that people came to see was the house. And what we've been able to do with archaeology is really begin to uncover what was at first what we really started to uncover were the homes for enslaved individuals. And I'm going to talk about a lot of these sites in the presentation. So this is the South Yard. This is actually where we're going to, it's reconstructed now. This is a shot from back in 2011. We're going to be eating dinner in the South Yard on Sunday night after we tour the house and do the, see the mere distinction of color, the exhibit in the cellar. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But, and this is the restored, what it looks like restored today. We've got another building we built, and actually you'll see where the kitchen is just coming up out of the ground right now. But not only have we found, the sites of the slaves who worked and lived by the main house, but also the field slaves. This is down in the home quarter, the home farm where you all are going to be excavating this week. Just over to the left where the cedar tree is the overseer's house, and the visitor center is right up there. And what's made these sites most obvious, and this is one of the reconstructed field quarters that we reconstructed about 3 years ago at this site right here that we excavated in 2012. But what makes these sites most visible is just the large amount of artifacts that show up at these sites. Because where you have a living site, you've got broken ceramics, animal bone, bottle glass, and those, when you do survey, show up quite easily. But there's a lot of other sites that, and what's really really fascinating about these slave quarters that we excavate out at is, well, in the main house, we've got lists and descriptions of what the Madisons owned and ate off of and what was in the house. For the slave quarters, we don't have even one description of any of the slave quarters at Montpelier. We have one insurance map that I'll show you in a few minutes. But we have really, with if we were just going off of the documentary records, we would have no idea what the slaves owned, what they ate off of, what they purchased at market. And what we've been able to uncover is really the domestic lives of slaves. But as slaves, one of the things that, that was in, and for slaves, most of their time was spent, especially for field slaves, is in the fields, but also, working in the agricultural buildings like storage sheds, granaries, and then of course in the fields themselves. And this is a topic that we'll touch on when we go to some of the wooded sites during next week, and what we've been doing to find these sites, both through metal detector survey that I'll talk a little bit about today, but then also through LiDAR. And I'm pretty sure that in the readings I sent you all the story maps on the home farm, but I can't remember if I sent the Eastwoods, and that's a really compelling set of excavations that we've done out there. And I'm going to just jot myself a note to make sure that you all have that. So Eastwoods, and for the we'll get into this in a few minutes, but for these buildings, like I mentioned, for the slave quarters, so much of what we find at these quarters is the items that break, the ceramics, the glass, and they would get thrown out close to the house. And this is similar to what we're going to be finding at the overseer's house. The overseer's house is where the overseer and his household was living. So there's all kinds of similar things to this. This is a neck for a wine bottle, ceramics and tobacco pipes, that sort of thing. But at a barn, if, say, for example, this granary right here, or more, let's look at the storage shed, because it doesn't have a foundation. And this is like a lot of the buildings at Montpelier. If this building decayed, what do you think would be left to be found in the ground if all the wood went away? What would you find, 200 years later? And I'm going to make this short. I'm going to call on you, Sarah. Are you there, Sarah?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, okay.
My first thought was maybe like nails or things to keep the building together might be left behind.
Yeah, that is exactly right, Sarah. The nails. That is what we rely on almost exclusively for finding these structures. Because, you know, at a barn, or in this case, a storage shed, you're not going to find broken ceramics or bone because no one's living there. But when the wood decays, what gets left is the nails. And then using metal detector survey that you all are going to see this coming week and actually help map in some of the hits, we can not only find the sites, but then figure out where the exact spot where the buildings are. And I'll give an example of that with the tobacco barn that we excavated about 8 years ago. So the other part of this is, you know, the fields, like we're in some cases where crops are processed, like in this case, this is potatoes that have been dug up by enslaved workers somewhere in Virginia, and then hoeing and ditching. A lot of these sites can be found especially in wooded areas with LiDAR surveys, and I'll send you an article on that. But for why all this is important to Montpelier, it gets into, you know, power of place. If we've got, you know, beautiful rolling countryside around Montpelier that looks like, you know, just the only thing that happened there was sheep grazed there, and you never knew that it was a field where people labored and they were enslaved, you know, obviously that's going to be a big difference in terms of how you see it. You know, seeing something that just as pretty bucolic landscape where you might have a picnic, as opposed to this is where people were basically in a labor camp, which is what a plantation is. There's nothing short of it. A forced labor camp where if they tried to escape, they would be caught and whipped and returned to the field. So it's a very different feel. And depending on who you are, I mean, if you're a descendant, you know, you're going to look at this with your ancestors being there in a very different way than if you're, you know, you've never thought about a plantation. And that's where we want to, you know, really, you know, explore some of this over the week, and how all this intersects with history. And the reason why we were interested in all this is we want to do full-scale restoration. And what we mean by restoration is actually, you know, there's the physical restoration you think of, but also restoration of history, restoration of the stories that were there, and all the stories that were present at a place like Montpelier. Also, we've got a lack of documentary records. Unfortunately, how many of y'all have been to Monticello? Maybe, I don't know if you could do your hand signal. Yeah, thumbs up. Yeah, you know what Monticello? It's on the back of the nickel. Everybody, if you haven't even been there, you can just look at your change and see it there. But at Monticello, they've got this amazing set of records that detail everything from where the fields were, how many acres of wheat and rye that Jefferson had his slaves growing, to what the yields were. And we completely lack that at Montpelier because of some of the history. There was James and Dolly Madison, when they were married in 1787. This was the second marriage for Dolly Madison. She was first married as a Quaker in Philadelphia, where they met. And her husband and infant son died in a yellow fever outbreak in 1792. And so when James and Dolly were married in 1795, she brought her son. He became James Madison's stepson by the name of John Payne Todd. He dies some 6 years after his mom in the 1850s. And when he died, by the time he dies, he's accumulated all of the plantation papers from Montpelier at his home down in Gordonsville. And when all of Madison's nieces and nephews go to John Payne Todd's house in 1754, they basically take 2 rooms of documents that have all this history of the agricultural history, sale of slaves, haul it all to the back lawn, and then put a match to it to get rid of all these documents, because they feel that their Uncle Jimmy was a very private man, and they wouldn't want anyone prying into his life. So with that, you know, he lost all these records. But what we have at Montpelier is this incredible archaeological record. And a lot of this archaeological record is formed during the Madison period, from the 1720s through the 1844, when Dolly sells the property. And after that, you have really, in many ways, 2 centuries of preservation. The period from 1844 to 1901, you go from over 100 slaves down to about 25 before the Civil War. And then after that, the plantation goes into economic decline. There's not a lot of working of the land. And then when the DuPonts buy the land in 1901, they basically buy it as a country estate. So all through the 20th century, where you have mechanized plowing elsewhere, not a lot happens. And I'll talk about this in a second. The mansion gets expanded significantly, but the landscape remains untouched. And so by the time the trust gets it from the DuPont family in 1984, you've got, this 2,700 acres that's incredibly well preserved. And of that, we've got and here's the visitor core, here's Route 20. When you come in on Sunday, you're going to be coming in through the gate here and then across center field past the racetrack. This is all, was built by the DuPonts. And then coming up and turning into the visitor center. Actually, I'm sorry, you're going to be going over to the Constitution Village and checking in over here. So you'll be coming down this road, checking in at the Constitution Village up here, and then going up to the house by 4 o'clock to do the house tour, and then also mere distinction of color. And actually, Emma and Aaron remind me, I'll tell you all where to check in, which is Lewis Hall. That's where the keys are going to be. With the property, we have of the 2,700 acres, we have about 1,800 acres of woods. And in these woods are all these sites. And of course, there's also sites in the field. Where we're excavating this week is down in this area at the overseer's house. What's in yellow is the Madison-owned lands in the basically from the 1730s up until 1844. And so within what's owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, about 3/4 to 2/3 of the land is this original Madison core. And we've got the visitor core is also the core of the plantation. So we've just got some amazing sites to really, showcase and analyze for figuring out what this place looked like. So with the what we've surveyed, and I'll talk more about this when we're out talking about metal detector surveys. You'll notice all these green areas here. These are metal detector surveys that we've done. And some of the story maps that you might have looked at already go into this. This is these GIS maps. These are 20-meter surveys. And what we've been able to do from these surveys and earlier surveys, all these yellow polygons are sites that we found. A lot of them are Civil War encampments, but all the smaller ones like this size, most of these are all Madison era sites that we've located. And you can see when you get into the visitor core, it's just a mess of yellow and red. This is just the mother lode of sites right there in the visitor core, between the main house down to the visitor center and then down to where we're working in this area. So, and I'll get into these a little bit more. But for the history of Montpelier, just a quick thumbnail sketch. There's 3 generations of Madisons that own Montpelier, and they really they have the enslaved workers look to utilize the land in very different ways. The original the first generation was the grandmother, Frances Madison. She runs Montpelier basically from 1732 when her husband dies up until 1761. And she is the one who is really, she markets tobacco under her own name through the 1740s and 50s. And we could get into a lot of the details with this, but I'm going to kind of gloss over it. But suffice to say, in the colonial period, the dominant crop was tobacco. And up until 1761, Frances Madison was the one who was operating the tobacco part of the estate. And what her son was doing, and this is, the kind of agriculture that happens with the tobacco is what's called slash and burn, where they would girdle the trees, and then the slaves would hoe piles of soil and plant the tobacco in these hills. And so tobacco is very nutrient dependent, so it just strips a lot of the nutrients out of the soil. And within about 30 years, a lot of what after 1761, what Francis's son, James Madison Sr. starts to do is to start having his slaves plow the land for more grain products. And James Madison Sr., this is James Madison Sr. and Nellie Conway Madison, the mother of James Madison. they run Montpelier as a very diversified plantation. Like they initially build a planter's cottage, have a planter's cottage built for them in 1750. The main house isn't built until 1765. And when the grandmother, this is Frances Madison, grandmother of the president, mother of James Madison Sr., while she's alive, what James Madison Sr. does is he, instead of having his slaves, his portion of the enslaved community grow tobacco, he starts diversifying the plantation with blacksmithing, jobbing out slaves for carpentry, being a merchant factor, means he imports goods and sells them to the local community. And this is what allows Montpelier in many ways to survive the ups and downs of the tobacco economy that you might read about in Virginia history. And when James Madison, the future president, begins to really inherit the property in the 1790s, he inherits a money-making venture. It's not in debt, and this is because of this diversification of the parents. And what he's able to do is really pursue his political career in a way that he wouldn't have been able to if the plantation had been in debt by the 1790s. And so when James and Dolly are married in 1795, one of the things they do is they add on to the house. It goes from this colonial structure with these outbuildings to a more federal era house where they add a duplex onto the north side and add this front portico, but leave the outbuildings as they were, into the 1790s, early 18 teens. And at this time, what Madison starts to do is he starts to try to develop more scientific farming techniques, where he's having his overseers have the slaves manure the fields, do contour plowing. And this really doesn't make much money for him much past the 18 teens. And in 1801, when James and Dolly basically returned to DC because he becomes Secretary of State for 2 terms under Jefferson, and then the president starting in 1808, what they start to make changes with the Montpelier is by this time, James Madison Sr., the father, has died, and what they do is make massive changes to the landscape where they get rid of there was a blacksmith shop over in this area during the colonial period. That gets moved out to where we're going to be excavating at the overseer's house. And this larger formal landscape is developed. And you all might have, you remember reading some of this in some of the articles, which is, this picturesque landscape where, they have this large entertainment area. And why, do y'all remember what the Madisons were trying to do with this landscape, this larger set of grounds, especially after they retire? And I'm going to call on you, Shane. Do you have your ears on, Shane? Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, I do. Unfortunately, I don't remember what they were trying to do with that part of the land. But
bear with me, Shane. I think we'll be able to figure it out. When James and Dolly are president, Dolly's when James is president from 1808 to 1816. Dolly does a lot of entertaining. That's what everybody knows Dolly for, is the entertainment. When, in terms of having these, what they call squeezes at the White House, where they would bring both parties in on these once a week. And Dolly would bring everybody in to really, based on her hospitality and entertaining, and of course she worked with, had enslaved individuals at the White House doing this. But she would bring all these folks together at Washington and basically have them be received by Madison and then hash out some of the political issues that were going on at the time. When they retire back at Montpelier and they've got this large estate, what do you think they want to do with, the wealthy people that are coming by?
They probably still maybe want to kind of wine and dine them and be a part of the political scene, just to know what's going on. So maybe just having an area that's really nice and picturesque outside is a nice area to host this type of event.
Yeah, exactly. This is, they would be receiving people at Montpelier for this same sort of entertaining. And you're exactly right. A lot of this was to, they would be able to find out what was going on in Washington with people that are visiting. And, you know, if you're going through the Virginia Piedmont, say you're going from DC down to Charlottesville, where UVA was at that time after 1820, you would go by Montpelier, and you wouldn't just have dinner there. You would spend the night, because there's no Holiday Inn, there's no Airbnb, there's no bed and breakfast. These are the places that wealthy people would stay. So they basically had this entertainment complex. And what's great about this is the folks that were visiting were literate. They had time to write letters, and so they wrote about these experiences. And so a lot of what we know about the Montpelier comes from these visitor diaries and letters that were written in the 1820s and 30s when people would come to visit Montpelier. And what becomes very apparent, you know, like from looking at the history of this time period and what's going on with these parties, is not only are the Madisons entertaining and people are visiting there to visit the Sage of Montpelier, but this is where a lot of the Madisons' finances are being brokered. So the same folks that are visiting also have extended lines of credit to the Madisons, and these parties serve as this double function where, you know, if Dolly and James Madison are entertaining in high style, it would become apparent to anyone that, you know, that has loaned them money, that they might be able to extend another line of credit to them and not just ask for their money back. So this, you know, it has an economic end. And also at this time, James and Dolly Madison are working on the notes on the Constitutional Convention that they want to, Madison plans when he dies, because these notes on the Constitutional Convention were kept secret by anyone that was in the convention until the last member of the convention dies. And Madison was one of the last people who passed away who was part of the convention. Is that the plans were for Dolly to sell these. And so there's a lot of, you know, wheeling and dealing going on with this. What's also going on is that by the time you get to this period in the 1820s and 30s, they're not making any money on the farm. You know, one, they're doing a lot of entertaining. They've spent, you know, about 10 years modifying the parents' landscape and house into this entertainment grounds. And what begins to happen, especially in the 1820s, is they start to sell off land, but then in the late 1820s also start to sell off slaves. And this finally occurs in a major way after James Madison dies. He dies in 1836. And when he passes away, this is when between 1836 and about 1844, when about 2/3 of the slaves are sold. And when you get into this period, it really becomes evident why, you know, what Madison's priorities were as a founding father, and how his life as a slave owner and also a founding father really meshed together in some of the fabric that created the basis for our country. And this, we're going to get into this on Sunday night when we go through the house and the exhibit Mere Distinction of Color. But this time period where Madison is able to, you know, Dolly is the one, Madison sells some of the slaves, but Dolly sells about 2/3 of the slaves after Madison's death, is the ability for, you know, for a founding father or any slave owner or landowner who owns people to sell slaves. Some, you know, this is like 70 years after the Constitution, 70 years after America becomes independent, becomes, you know, land of the free, home of the brave. About another, this is like 50 years after the Constitutional Convention has been brokered, and we've got this Constitution. I mean, it really shows how, depending on who you were, the Constitution and you know, the Bill of Rights and citizenship pertain very different. It is very different for different groups of people. And for if you were, you know, here at Montpelier in 1820, you know, who would be able to enjoy the rights of citizenship? Who would be the one that would, you know, what were your defining characteristics to be a full functioning citizen in the U.S.?
A white landowning male.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you, Katie. That is exactly right. And the white part of that is probably pretty self-evident, because skin color is what allowed the powers that be to differentiate who was enslaved and who was not. I mean, if you were a free Black individual in Richmond at this time, and you weren't either with a white person or who could vouch for you, or have papers that were completely airtight, you could be taken off the street, put in jail, and then sold. You had to prove not that you were a slave, but that you were free. And so this skin color is what identifies you. Being male versus female, I mean, that's something that goes back, eons, and with both, in Europe in general, but especially in England, the rules of primogeniture and being a patriarchal society, have been with us for generations, and all these things still haunt us, obviously, today, and a lot of it is coming to a head today, which is really centuries in the making. And then the landowning part really gets into kind of the ideal Republican citizen is someone who is educated. And what really is often is was predicated on your ability to vote is to be able to read. And that's because, the ideal citizen for the founding fathers were folks that would be aware of what the political issues were, and with the landowning and property owning had a vested interest. If you're a laborer who was uneducated, you got to wait for the Jacksonian democracy period of the 1820s to be, part of, and be white and male as well, to be part of this. So you've got this, the real, clincher in this for Montpelier is this aspect of being free or slave. And for Madison and the founding fathers, it was one that was unconditional on, putting the emphasis on preserving the economy of slavery. And by the time, and we'll get into this in the exhibit, but when you get into the 1820s and 30s, the U.S. becomes a global economic power because of slavery. And that economy is what holds the country together. It's what allows the taxation to occur. It allows the wealth to be developed in this country. And any threat to that, the politicians, I mean, they're fighting about it in the 1830s, everything with the fugitive slave laws, is the ability for people to retain their personal property of human beings is what people are fighting for. Fighting the Civil War has been threatened for close to 30 years before the Civil War ever happens. And what Madison writes on his deathbed is this pamphlet called Advice to My Country, in which he basically says, treat any force that divides the Union as opening up Pandora's box, as the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and basically makes the choice that that keeping the Union together is more important than solving the issue of slavery. And this is really lived out in his own life as a slave owner. And he knows that with the debts he has, the only way Dolly is going to be able to recover and not be either literally go to the poorhouse, or be more likely, she wouldn't have gone to the poorhouse because of her prestige, but be absolutely humiliated, would be to sell the slaves. And that's what happens in 1844, is the slaves at Montpelier are all sold. And that's what generates the wealth that allows Dolly to continue her lifestyle in Washington, D.C. After the slaves are sold, Montpelier goes into a series of ownerships. And by the late 1840s, all the buildings around the house, the slave quarters, are torn down. And when you look at the larger plantation, this is when so many of the fields return to woods. And this map right here, what's in green is woods today. Of the 1,800 acres that we have in woods, there's probably about 400 acres of woods back in the early 19th century. And we'll go over more of the Civil War when when Chris takes you out to the encampments. But one of the most important things that happens around this time period is the main farm complex shifts from the area between the main house and the visitor center, and where we're working at where the overseer's house is by the Madison Family Cemetery, over to where you all are going to be staying throughout the week in the evenings at the village. All this farm complex down here gets developed in the 1850s, and that's where all the future development happens at Montpelier. So during the DuPont period, this is where all the new buildings get built, and it leaves all this area alone to be archaeological sites, which is great for job security and all the things that we love to do at Montpelier, you know, discovering this enslaved past. So the Civil War encampments, there are just numerous Civil War encampments at Montpelier, which is really, you know, great for the archaeology, but then also answers the question that many visitors have, what happened here during the Civil War, but also allows us to talk about the legacy of Madison, because there's not many countries, I don't know of any other country that goes through a civil war like the US did, and then had the same system of government before the Civil War as after. And a lot of this gets into, you know, the amendment system that allows change to occur and what Madison designs in with the Constitution. But in and we've got the summer encampments on the south side of Montpelier, and then we've got the winter encampments on the north side. And this is where you all will do some tours on later on in the week to see some of these encampments. And we've actually got reconstructed huts that you can see there as well. We actually rebuilt these last fall, Aaron and Emma, with part of our log cabin program. So it was some amazing. We talked about some of the presence of slaves at the encampments as well, which is a whole nother story. But following the emancipation, the end of Civil War, this is where Montpelier really in some ways goes into decline, but then you get a lot of, like, for the owners, but in terms of the estate, there's a number of free black farms that are developed. And this is one of these is the Gilmore cabin that we've restored, and just has a fascinating history. And it's what really got us into working with a local descendant community with the Gilmore family. And that started in 2000, and it's been going on for 20 years with what we're doing with the restored spaces at Montpelier. But what leads to the real preservation of Montpelier is this DuPont period of the 20th century. In 1901, when the DuPonts buy the property, they basically take the house and triple it in size and make the rest of the property into a country estate. And so with that, you know, so much of the landscape is left untouched. It just still is shocking to me how lucky we are to have such, you know, really pristine, unplowed sites at Montpelier, and just some of the serendipity of how we're purchased and bought, and you can really witness this when you're on the landscape. It's just makes Montpelier a very, very, very special place to talk about a lot of this history. And for Montpelier, we've gone through a restoration, and I'm gonna zip through this pretty quick. We starting in 2004, we restored the house from the DuPont main house back to the Madison period, and we used really archaeological forensic investigations to do this. In the house was all this Madison fabric that had just been moved around, and we're able to finish with a restored house that was set in a 20th century landscape. And that's when we started, you know, turning to the documentary record that showed what some of this looked like for, you know, clues of where to start digging. And for example, in the front area, this is where we discovered this front fence that's shown on the 1818 watercolor. And from the archaeology, we're able to find the post holes that marked where these posts are. So these are basically holes that are dug in the ground by slaves, and the post was installed. This is in the 18 teens. And what we found at the bottom of these were these charred remains of the post, where Madison had his slaves char the post to protect it from insect infestation, and it leaves these impressions. So this is, you know, in many ways is kind of a, you know, like the bread and butter of archaeology, where you're using these different soil colors as clues, and, you know, even using what would be, you know, what would seem like not an artifact, this charred wood, to give clues on the shape of and size of the post that you can see right here, and even the wood species. So when we do the archaeology, we're trying to get every last bit of information out of the ground. But for this, what we're able to do is, figure out the layout of the fence and the road, and then restore this back to the landscape. And so this, became the model for how to really look at the larger landscape and use the physical evidence to bring the restored landscape back. And so we've done this, all over the grounds over the past 20 years, both from, the fence line out front to the pine alley and the grove. We've done excavations in these areas to uncover the where the plantings were. We still need to do work on the back lawn to figure out this back fence, but we found everything. And then for a lot of what we get into is, our love of trash comes from, this is where, we recover all the material goods. So for example, that we found a trash deposit associated with the dining room where the enslaved workers threw all the broken dishes out. This is, bucket truck is parked here looking in this direction towards the temple. And in this downslope area, we found, thousands of sherds of porcelain, ceramics, French porcelains, imported transfer print wares, and then, the evidence for the feasts the Madison were having with these oyster shells, champagne bottles. All this helped us figure out what was on the dining room table. And in a similar fashion, when we did excavations for the south yard, this is inside the formal grounds of the house. In the south yard, we had an insurance plat that showed where these buildings were. And when we did excavations in the south yard, not only did we find the buildings from the foundations, but also in this bottom area, all these trash remains from where the slaves are throwing their household goods. And Terry on Monday is going to get into the excavations we did in the south yard and how we, both reconstructed the buildings and then furnished the houses based on the archaeology. And one thing we'll talk about on Sunday night is the importance that the important role the descendant community had with this. And this was not only for, beginning to connect with the descendants on having them help to discover their ancestors' past. I mean, holding an artifact in their hand and the last person who touched it was, one of their ancestors, was just incredibly moving. And it really got us into working with the descendants on planning how to interpret this space. And this is where, the mere distinction of color of the exhibit you'll see on Sunday night really came into play. Is we had the descendants work with us on planning that exhibit and what the themes would be, like in terms of, looking at the intersection between race, the Constitution, and slavery, and how this was a founding part of our country, but also the Constitution. And then using the dialogue that comes from that to really theme a lot of what we do, is to have discussions, hard discussions about the founding of the country and where, a lot of the heritage of race comes from in this country and how, the economic base that it has. So with the South Yard, this is where most visitors expect to come to, what they expect to see at Montpelier. What we're doing right now is expanding into what would have been the farm complex. And this is where, most of the folks, the enslaved Americans who worked at Montpelier what they were doing was more agricultural labor. And what we found below the visitor center, so in this picture, the main house is up here, here's the visitor center, and here's the parking lot. Real quick show of hands, how many folks have been to Montpelier before? I've totally forgot to ask that at the beginning. So a couple of folks have been. Yeah, this this area is basically rolling fields today. But what it would have looked like is this was loaded with buildings. I mean, there were everything from slave quarters to work sheds, the overseer's house, and how we've been able to discover some of these sites is through traditional archaeology. But a lot of the sites, the ones in red, the only way we found these is through metal detector surveys. And these metal detector surveys, this is the for those of you all, was anybody able to get into the story maps, those web-based stories that have the maps that look like this? Were you all able to see those? And for those of you all that haven't, definitely look at those. But for those of you that did, how do we do metal detector surveys? Do we just kind of randomly go out and just start metal detecting where we think would be a good spot to dig, or do we use a different kind of scientific method? And I'm going to call on, is it Keely Doyle?
Yes, that's me.
Hi, Keely. How are you?
I'm doing good. I actually did not get a chance to look at that yet, but I would.
Okay. Well, thanks for being honest.
Yeah, I would guess that you do something more scientific than just what you would think.
Yeah. It would be fun just to go out and hit the hot spots where you'd think there'd be sites. But what we do is, for a lot of metal detectors, they're like, oh my goodness, you sweep every inch of the land with a grid. That sounds like a nightmare. And it is until you start finding things, but it also is great to have the data. So what we do is we use gridded metal detector survey to basically not only make sure we hit every spot, but then also we're able to map the hits. So in this case, this is a heat map where the red is concentrations where you have sites. What's in green probably was fields back in the day. And when we sweep the area and do grid counts, it allows us to create these maps, but then also recover the nails. 99% of the artifacts are nails. And to date, we can date these nails based on their manufacturing characteristics. And what's great about this is from the American Revolutionary period through the antebellum, the mid-19th century, you get about 4 major nail manufacturing techniques that change over time. And what we're able to do is date the sites based on those. So in the end, what we're able to do is not only find these sites, and here's a zoom in of, here's the main house, the visitor center, and here's all these sites. This is the overseer site where we're going to be working on. If we blow up this area again, what you can see is where these concentrations are where, in a lot of cases, these domestic sites are. They really show up with the metal detector surveys. But then you get these other, orange blobs that are high concentrations of sites in the blacksmith, which also, as you imagine, a blacksmith where you're working with iron, you're having thousands of hits. This, basically when Dennis metal detected this area, he had to take his headphones off. It was so loud. It was just insane. And he's actually going to be beginning the metal detector surveys at this site next week. So you'll all be in for a treat. He's spending Monday and Tuesday just digging hits for you all, and then you'll be able to see what he found. He's super excited about having you all out to see that. But what we're able to do is not only find the sites, but also figure out what the dates were. So most of these sites date to the 18 teens, the retirement years, which fits in perfectly with our restoration and interpretive period. And then once we find these sites, what we do is this area right here is about the size of a 20-meter grid. Is then what we do is we hone in, and does anybody remember what size? I shouldn't be giving all the information. Does anybody remember what size we go down from? We go from 20 meters down to what size? And Maddie, I'm going to pick on you. Do you remember?
I'm not sure.
Well, here it is on the screen.
Perfect.
So.
Yep, 10 feet.
Yeah, the 10-foot grid. Yeah, thank you, Maddie. I sometimes just want to have other people talk because I feel like I'm just blathering on too much. I want to make sure you all are awake. So thanks, Maddie. Then we go down to a 10-foot grid, and then what that allows us to do is it's like going from a really pixelated picture that's only like 200 DPI by 800 or by 80 DPI to like a high resolution image where all of a sudden you can begin to see where the buildings are. So where you all are going to be excavating this week at the overseer's house, we use this 10-foot survey to locate where the building is. And this is, we've got a great example, and I'll let you all look at the story maps because they're right at 4:27, and I don't want to go too late tonight. But look at the story maps, and I'll send out the links to the home farm, because the story map was a link buried in a document, like in about 8 documents we sent you all. So I can understand why you didn't find it. I'll send that out along with the Eastwoods survey where we use LiDAR as well. But basically with the metal detector surveys, we're able to find not only where the buildings are, and in that a story map, I detailed the threshing barn, where we used the 10-foot survey to find the building, and then we actually did excavations and found these features in the excavations that turn out to be the remains of this threshing barn that used to be a tobacco barn. And that story is detailed in that story map, so I'll let you all look at that. But then also this map right here, you go from the metal detector grid to this 3D reconstruction that shows what we think this area looked like. And what we're involved in over the next 3 years is testing the areas that are in, the areas that are shown in yellow. Yeah, this is right. The areas that are in yellow are the areas that we're going to do metal detector survey on, and then excavation. And then the overseer's house is what we're starting with. This is a project that's funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we're doing in conjunction with the Descendant Committee, the community that has become a formalized institution, and I'll talk more about that on Sunday. But for the overseer's house site, Terry's going to go into the details on Monday about the research questions for that. But when we're out there, I want to show you when we're, some of the road networks that were there. And what Dennis was able to do was, you've got the roads that are here today, like Westgate Road. When you come in on Monday, we're going to be walking across this landscape. But then on Tuesday, you're going to start parking up in this area by the cemetery, and we'll show you how to get there. But back in the day, there was a very different road network. With this land plat from 1844, that's where we're able to figure out that this was the overseer's house. And Terry's going to go into this in a lot of detail on Monday. But what we also were able to figure out from the surveys is where some of these roads were. And these roads are a structuring force on the landscape and really allow us to know where the overseer's house begins and where some of these other sites are, like this blacksmith shop on this ridge. So, but once we find these sites and define them with a metal detector survey, that's where we go in with the excavations and begin, to uncover the actual artifacts and hopefully find the foundations of the buildings. So, but so I basically fed you all with a fire hose with all this information. So it hopefully complements some of what you read already and give you a really good synopsis of this is the Archaeology Booklet. It's the PDF. And we'll be giving you a copy of that when you arrive on Sunday for you to look at. And it has a lot of this information there as well. But does anybody have any questions or comments? Or Aaron and Emma, would you want anything else that I didn't cover, emphasized, or? Now I'm putting you all on the spot, so.
That's fair. I think one thing that I've been kind of jotting down a few notes, and one thing that I would emphasize as far as, thinking about what I've learned thus far about archaeology and connections with social studies, as well as the elementary curriculum, more writ large, is, Matt, when you were emphasizing kind of the importance of mapping with metal detecting, but I also know from our previous expeditions with you, the record keeping is also super important with mapping the color of soil, which you mentioned, and where artifacts are found. And so I think that that's something that I would emphasize as important in our building our understanding of archaeology, and maybe thinking about too, how that kind of record keeping is important historically, is important in helping us make sense of the past, our future students making sense of the past, and just kind of learning how history is made in that way, or uncovered in this way. That was one kind of theme that stuck out to me that I wanted to emphasize. Aaron?
Yeah, I'll add one more thing, which thanks for sharing that. Emma. It's another really important piece that stands out to me that I think ties into what Dr. Thacker is describing is that all of this, in many ways, could be done a lot of ways, right? There are a lot of ways this could be done. The thing that compelled me the most when I started learning about the work that was happening at Montpelier, before I ever met Matt, before I met any of the people that we now know as the archaeology department, was this extraordinary, I think, and important connection with the descendant community. And that involvement with the descendant community makes this a justice-oriented endeavor. Unlike, it's not just an organization mapping all of this out and maintaining one narrative, one white supremacist or white dominant narrative. And instead, it's an opportunity to add to that record that Dr. Thacker is describing, and it's also an opportunity to, include people in a history who have been marginalized or excluded entirely, or whitewashed out of it. And I think all of that is really exciting work to me. I mean, from the nitty-gritty of the archaeology to the connections to community-based archaeology that I think are absolutely exciting and so powerful. So I just wanted to point that theme out as well. You did a very nice job of describing it anyway, Matt. I just wanted to pull out that theme or tease it out and say that's something that's one of the key reasons why we see this as such an important course for all of you to be involved in. And I know it's been super important and transformative for me as well.
Yeah,
both of what you all said, Emma and Erin, is those two aspects. One is the preservation of the archaeological record. With, like, when we excavate a site, we're basically destroying it. And if we were just looking for the artifacts and not really concerned about all the layers of history and how they all work together, we would lose so much. And that what Dr. Thacker said in terms of recording the stratigraphy and mapping things out, making sure the artifacts go in their proper bags, that's an essential part of a very destructive science. Because once we dig something out of the ground, we can't really put it back in. We've removed that soil. We can never go back in place. And what we want to be able to do is be able to analyze it not only a month from now, but have somebody 20 years from now be able to reconstruct what we did. And what you mentioned, Dr. Bodle, with working with the community, as amazing as the sites are at Montpelier, what if it wasn't for the our collaboration with the community, that would have so much less meaning. It's that descendant community that really helps us focus on what are the stories that we need to be telling from this. And it really, one thing that archaeologists are doing more and more of these days is beginning to see themselves not as the experts. I mean, we are the experts in the methodology, like what you were talking about, Dr. Thacker, with the excavation techniques and how we do survey and what I talked about. I mean, I've been trained for I don't know how many years, a long time, to learn how to do all this. But in terms of providing this as a service to the community, just like a lawyer or an engineer or an architect would. The architect doesn't tell you what kind of house you're going to live in. There's an interaction there, and we want to do the same thing with the community. So those are really just quintessential points. Thank you all.
Sure.
If I could add or emphasize one other theme for our students, I would just remind us that Matt's presentation was called The Power of Place, which is another thing we're going to continue to think about as we gather on Sunday, and as we move into some of our on-site experiences. That the connections of people, like Dr. Bodle emphasized, place, artifacts, all of these themes we're going to kind of grapple with and think about what it means and why we're at Montpelier, and how being in this place is also hopefully going to add to the power of the experience.
Cool. Well, that's a great way to end this. Thank you all so much. And how is is everybody's coming on their own? I'm assuming they're driving their own cars. Okay, and did Sarah send you all directions for where to go? So I'm sure Sarah did that. She is very well organized, way more organized than I am. So awesome. So but that it should be what did you remember? Where does she have everybody meet? Is it?
She had us going to like cabin number 8 or something like that in Constitution Village.
Okay.
That's where the directions were to, I think.
All right. I will check with Sarah. I'll do a note to make sure that wherever she said for us to meet is where we'll meet for giving out the keys and paperwork and all that. So good deal. And again, if everybody could think about just have a plan for what your COVID response would be. If there is a situation where someone exhibits symptoms, we're going to end the program at that point because we need to. But then how you'd be getting home if you shared a ride, that sort of thing. Because that's once you get to Montpelier, and if you've shared a ride with somebody that if they or you had COVID symptoms, you wouldn't want to ride home with, it would be problematic. So just think about that. I mean, you can always, there's plenty of room to park cars at Montpelier, and you could, you'll be walking mostly. There's not a lot of places you need to drive except for maybe getting some supplies at night, but there's plenty of parking spots. So, but cool. And if anybody has any concerns, definitely email us, or I'm going to send you all the links, and I'll put my cell phone in there as well. And I'm going to be on tap, on Sunday for if anybody needs anything. So,
I
cool.
just have a super quick question about the waiver that we got the other day. I don't have access to a printer right now, so can I just email it back to you, or? Oh,
absolutely, Hannah. Yeah, thank you. That'd be fine. And we're going to have another copy of that for you all to sign, because like I said, the management of the housing wanted people to sign it on site as well. So
okay, thank you.
Yeah, if you send that to dig@montpelier.org, Hannah, that would be great.
Okay.
Cool.
Thanks so much, Matt. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I'll send this recording to you all, Aaron and Emma, along with those links. So, all right, we'll look forward to seeing you all on Sunday. I'm looking forward to the dinner on Sunday out there in the South Yard. It's going to be fun. So,
absolutely.
All right, bye everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.